Hey guys, tonight we begin with medieval Europe, a time when perfectly normal behaviors were treated as undeniable proof you'd lost your mind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the Middle Ages, daydreaming wasn't just suspicious. It was practically an invitation for the Inquisition to show up at your doorstep with a bucket of holy water and the energy of a man who hasn't blinked since Tuesday. If your eyes drifted anywhere other than soil, scripture, or unpaid taxes, people assumed you'd mentally wandered into hell's customer service lobby, the quiet loom at the edge of the village. You find yourself transported into a small medieval village, one that would have been utterly ordinary in its own time and almost invisible in the grand sweep of history. The buildings are simple, their timber frames darkened by years of smoke and weather. The roof sags slightly under the weight of old thatch. Narrow footpaths cut through the mud in winding patterns shaped by generations of hurried steps, wagon wheels, and grazing animals. The air carries the faint scent of damp earth, smoke from hearth fires, and the distant fragrance of wild herbs drying in someone's loft. In this quiet place, people live their lives with a certain predictable rhythm, a rhythm that has existed long before they were born and will continue long after they are gone. Their routines are simple, often repetitive, rooted in survival rather than ambition. And it is here, at the far edge of the village where the road meets the forest, that you meet her, a weaver named Elswith. Elswith's cottage is smaller than most, not because she is poor, but because her life requires little space. The main room holds a hearth, a table, a small bed, and, most importantly, the large wooden loom that dominates the far wall. The loom is not merely a tool for her. It is the heart of her existence, the structure around which her days are organized. If you listen carefully, you can hear the steady rhythm of her weaving even before you approach her door. It is a soft, persistent clack, the kind of repetitive sound that you might find soothing enough to fall asleep to. The villagers often remark on Elswith's solitude. They say she prefers her loom to people. They whisper about how she talks to herself, sometimes in a low murmur, sometimes in a rhythmic chant that echoes the movement of her hands. In a world where community is everything and isolation is viewed with suspicion, her behavior seems unusual. And in the medieval mind, unusual behavior is rarely left unexplained. There must always be a reason. So they label her, not with cruelty, but with caution, not with accusation, but with distance. They call her the one who mutters. They say she is touched. They wonder if something is wrong in her mind. But if you step inside her cottage, as you do now, you see a different story. Inside, the room is warm. Sunlight filters through the small round window, casting a patch of pale gold across the floor. The loom is positioned so that Elswith can weave while watching the light shift with the time of day. You notice how carefully she works, how precise her hands are as they guide each thread into place. She does speak softly to herself, but her words are not the ramblings the villagers imagine. They are instructions, patterns, reminders. a quiet way of keeping track of where she is in her work. You watch her lips move as she recites. Over, under, pull, tighten, over, under, pull, tighten. This is not madness. This is discipline. In today's world, you might call it self-guided focus, a natural way to maintain concentration, even a form of mindfulness. But in her world, where education is limited and literacy is rare, any behavior that does not align with the norm can be interpreted as a sign of instability. The loom creaks softly as she works, and the fabric grows inch by inch. Her cloth is known throughout the region for its durability and quiet beauty. Local merchants, traveling monks, and even noblemen's stewards purchase it. But Elswith has never cared for status or attention. She prefers the steadiness of her work, the simple comfort of watching tangled threads form something orderly beneath her hands. As she weaves, you sense that she carries a deep inner life, one that she rarely shares. Her solitude is not a burden, it is a choice. She enjoys the quiet because it allows her mind to wander along winding paths of memory and imagination. But to the medieval eye, a wandering mind is suspicious. You sit quietly as she continues her work, learning the cadence of her movements. She dips her fingers into a small clay bowl of water, moistening the thread to keep it smooth. She adjusts the warp with practiced precision. She tilts her head slightly to examine the emerging pattern. And each time she makes a decision, an adjustment, a correction, a shift in direction, she speaks softly to herself. You begin to understand that these murmured words are simply a part of her craft. They fill the silence in a controlled, intentional way. They help her maintain focus during long hours of repetitive movement. Yet you also sense that she speaks for another reason, one rooted deeper in her past. Elswith was once a child in a much busier household. She was the youngest of 5 siblings, often overlooked in the crowded simplicity of medieval family life. Her mother taught her weaving not out of affection, but out of necessity. Another pair of hands meant more cloth to sell. When she first began learning, she would murmur to herself because no one else listened to her. It was her way of hearing her own thoughts in a house where silence was a rare luxury. Over the years, murmuring became a habit, a comfort, a way to feel grounded. But in the village, people remember stories more eagerly than they understand them. They whisper about the time she was seen talking to no one near the forest's edge. They tell tales of how she stayed inside during feast days. They note how she rarely attends the gatherings at the marketplace unless she must. These small observations accumulate like fallen leaves, forming a story that does not entirely match the truth. In medieval society, behaviors that fell outside the expected rhythm of life, especially those involving solitude, repetition, or self-directed speech, were often interpreted through the limited lens of religious belief and folk wisdom. A person who spoke to themselves might be considered afflicted by melancholy, touched by spirits, or struggling with an imbalance of humors. But here, in her cottage, you see none of those things. You see a woman who finds meaning in order and peace in repetition. You see someone who uses quiet as a tool, not as a sign of distress. Her life might seem lonely to others, but to her, it is full of color and movement, full of intention. Outside, the villagers continue their routines, tending livestock, repairing fences, sweeping the pathways, preparing meals. Life is noisy. Life is communal. Life is relentless. But Elswith's world is different. Her loom offers a rare escape from the chaos of medieval survival. You notice a small shelf near the hearth holding a collection of dyed threads, soft blues, muted reds, earthy browns. The colors are gentle, natural, made from plants she gathers herself. You imagine her wandering quietly through the forest, collecting berries, bark, and leaves to boil and to dye. Another activity she prefers to do alone. Another behavior the villagers interpret as odd. You begin to understand how easily normal behavior, like talking to oneself, can be transformed into suspicion simply because it deviates from collective expectations. There is no privacy in village life. People observe each other constantly, and any deviance, no matter how harmless, becomes part of a whispered narrative. As you sit with her, the steady rhythm of the loom becomes almost hypnotic. The clacking is soft, repetitive, soothing. You sense how someone could spend hours, even days, lost in such work. In this space, her murmurs are not strange. They are natural, almost musical. You notice that when the thread snags, her voice softens into reassurance, as if she's comforting herself. It's all right. Try again. No hurry. Perhaps she has always spoken to herself in this way. Perhaps she always will. Yet even as her hands remain steady, you feel an undercurrent of something unresolved, a question that lingers quietly beneath her movements, something she thinks about but never says aloud. A memory, perhaps, or a tension between her inner world and the village that observes her from a distance. And it is here, in this quiet moment, as the sun shifts and shadows stretch across her cottage floor, that you begin to wonder. What moment in Elswith's life first convinced the villagers that her quiet murmuring was something to fear? And what might happen if that misunderstanding grows even deeper? The whispering forest and the weight of rumors. The days in the village unfold with a slow predictability, shaped not by clocks or schedules, but by the angle of the sun, the weather, and the necessities of survival. Morning arrives with the same pale light. Afternoons drift quietly toward dusk, and evenings hum with the ordinary sounds of crackling hearths and murmured conversations. For Elswith, the weaver at the edge of the village, these rhythms are both comforting and isolating. Her life is measured by the movements of her loom and the softness of her murmured words. But outside her cottage, the narrative that surrounds her is slowly shifting. It begins, as many medieval misunderstandings do, with a small observation, something harmless, ordinary, but unusual enough to draw attention. One autumn morning, just as the leaves are turning to a crisp bronze and the forest edges glimmer with thin frost, a young shepherd boy named Wyman passes by Elswith's cottage on his way to the pasture. He is no older than 11, curious in the way children tend to be, and prone to repeating anything that captures even a flicker of interest. He pauses near her window, not to spy, but simply to listen. The soft clacking of the loom catches his attention. Then he hears her voice, quiet, steady, rhythmic, rising and falling like the weaving itself. He cannot hear the words clearly, but the murmuring stays with him. Later, when he returns home for supper, he repeats the story at the family table. Elswith is talking to spirits, he says. He heard her speaking to someone unseen. His parents exchange glances. They know the story is likely just a child's impression, but in a world where the unseen is as real as the visible, such impressions are not easily dismissed. And like all good stories in a medieval village, it spreads quickly, from the shepherd's family to the neighboring household, from the alehouse to the churchyard, from the marketplace to the fields. In an age without books, gossip is its own form of literature. It shapes belief, influences judgment, and becomes part of the village's unwritten chronicles. But if you step inside her cottage, where you sit now, quietly observing, you see nothing of the supernatural. You see only the familiar routine of her weaving, the careful movements, the gentle tension of the threads, the soft murmuring that helps her maintain focus. Nothing is strange here. Nothing is threatening. And yet, the village begins to reinterpret her silence and solitude through the lens of imagination. The murmuring becomes chanting. Her solitude becomes secrecy. Her forest walks become nighttime wanderings. Most of these claims are exaggerated or entirely invented, but in a small community where people rely heavily on shared narratives, there is a certain comfort in aligning unusual behaviors with familiar explanations, even if those explanations are wrong. As the days grow colder, Elswith spends more time gathering herbs and bark for dyes. The autumn season offers a final chance to collect late-growing plants before winter withers them. You walk with her into the forest one afternoon, following a small footpath that leads into a thicket of oak and birch. The forest is quiet in a way that feels ancient. Leaves crunch softly beneath your feet. Birds settle in the branches overhead, their calls echoing between the trunks. Elswith moves slowly, intentionally, scanning the ground for plants she knows by heart. She bends carefully to collect alder bark for producing soft brown tones, then picks the last remaining woad leaves for blue. As she works, she speaks to herself, not loudly, not strangely, but simply as a form of thought made audible. 3 handfuls, no more, leave the roots untouched. It is the same tone she uses at her loom, the same rhythm, the same soft presence of mind. You understand her, but others, watching from a distance, might not. Indeed, someone is watching. Near the forest's edge, half concealed by a hawthorn bush, stands a woman named Ida, one of the most talkative people in the village. She has been searching for mushrooms for her stew when she noticed Elswith's familiar figure moving through the trees. Curious, and perhaps hoping for something interesting to tell later, she approaches quietly. She hears Elswith's voice before she sees what she is doing. The murmuring, when isolated from context, seems strange. Ida cannot hear the words, only the low cadence of them. All she sees is Elswith bending over plants and speaking softly toward the ground. Later that evening, Ida retells the story in the alehouse. By the time the tale spreads, Elswith is no longer simply murmuring. She is speaking incantations, summoning something, calling names the villagers do not know. And so, through misunderstanding and exaggeration, the weaver's private habits become public concern. But while the villagers whisper, Elswith remains unaware of the growing tension. She continues weaving each day, maintaining the steady rhythm that has guided her life since childhood. She warms her hands by the hearth, prepares her meals, simple bread and broth, and tends to her dye pots. Her solitude, to her, is peaceful. To others, it now feels suspicious. One evening, after a particularly cold day, the village gathers in the church for Vespers. The local priest, Father Dunstan, delivers a sermon about vigilance, humility, and the dangers of allowing one's mind to wander into temptation. He does not mention Elspeth by name. Priests rarely accuse directly, but his tone is clear enough that several villagers exchange knowing glances. He speaks of those who whisper to what cannot be seen, and those who seek secrets in the quiet places of the world. He warns the congregation that solitude can open the mind to dangerous influences. He reminds them that melancholy is a dark path, easily mistaken for peace. These words, vague as they are, settle over the village like mist. After the service, people discuss his sermon in hushed tones. Some express concern, others shrug it off, but no one directly challenges the idea that something unusual is happening. In medieval times, religion and superstition blend effortlessly, and fear of the unknown, especially fear tied to mental health, often hides beneath the surface of daily life. Meanwhile, Elspeth's inner world remains quietly unchanged. You return to her cottage the next day, finding her at the loom as always. But there is something new in the air, a faint tension she herself does not seem to notice. You watch her work as she hums a soft, wordless tune. The murmur is different today, lighter, almost melodic. It seems to help her maintain focus as she experiments with a new pattern. She does not yet realize that the village's tolerance for difference is beginning to falter. As she works, you reflect on how the medieval understanding of mental health relies heavily on outward appearances. Talking to oneself, something that might be considered harmless today, could easily be interpreted as a sign of spiritual disturbance or melancholy. Solitude could be seen as dangerous. A wandering mind could be labeled as unstable. In this world, the line between normal behavior and perceived madness is thin. You note, for example, how the villagers treat other individuals with quirky habits. A fisherman who mutters prayers at the river is considered pious. A child who speaks to animals is called imaginative. A craftsman who works late into the night is labeled dedicated. But a woman who speaks softly to herself, alone, without an obvious reason, becomes a subject of scrutiny. Elspeth herself remains unaware of how closely people are watching her. She has always lived quietly, existing on the margins of village life. To her, the villagers' interest in her is minimal. She does not imagine that they would discuss her at length. And yet the whispers continue to grow, gathering weight with each retelling. One afternoon, as she returns from the forest with a bundle of dried plants, two villagers, Leofric and Ida, stand near the well, their conversation just loud enough for her to hear fragments of it. Saw her again, muttering, always by herself. You know how these things begin? Elspeth pauses for a moment. A flicker of uncertainty crosses her face. She is not oblivious. She senses the shifts in tone and posture when people speak near her. She hears the pauses in their words, the slight tightening of their expressions. But she is unsure what has prompted this sudden change. And for now, she chooses to ignore it, returning to the safety of her loom. Later that evening, as the sun sinks low, she sits by the hearth, dipping the newly collected bark into a pot of warm water. The fire crackles softly, Her murmurs are slower now, almost reflective, as though she is thinking through something deeper than her work. You sense a heaviness settling over her, a subtle awareness that something is shifting around her. She is not frightened, but she feels the tension building in ways that are difficult to name. Outside, the villagers conclude their tasks for the day. The livestock are penned, the fires dampened, the door bars lowered. But the conversations about Elswith continue in small, quiet gatherings. Some are genuinely concerned. Some are simply curious. Some enjoy the novelty of a developing mystery. In a world where entertainment is limited, even the smallest oddity becomes a story worth repeating. As you sit with Elswith in her dimly lit cottage, you begin to wonder how long she can remain unaware of, or unaffected by, the murmured suspicions growing around her. You realize that misunderstandings, left unchecked, have a way of gaining momentum. And in medieval times, where knowledge is limited and fear is abundant, such momentum can become dangerous. You watch the firelight flicker across her face as she leans back, resting her hands after a long day of work. She closes her eyes for a moment, exhaling softly, completely unaware of how the villagers are shaping a story about her, one that could change her quiet life forever. And as the evening settles into silence, you cannot help but wonder. When the village's curiosity turns into concern, and concern turns into fear, what will happen to a woman whose only unusual habit is speaking softly to herself? The day the village knocked on her door, the cold wind sweeps through the village with an early winter sharpness, carrying with it the muted sounds of distant hammering, bleating goats, and the rustle of drying leaves. Days grow shorter, nights stretch longer, and with each passing week the air holds a nervous stillness, as though the entire village is waiting for something to happen. They do not know what they are waiting for, but they feel the tension gathering in the small spaces between everyday tasks. Elswith feels it too, though she cannot name it. She notices the change most clearly in the silences that follow her footsteps at the marketplace, in the half-smiles that look strained, and in the glances people exchange when she passes by. She senses the small shift in how the blacksmith's wife greets her, too quickly, too brightly. She sees the way children fall quiet when she approaches. These changes are subtle, but in a village where every detail of life is interwoven like threads on a loom, even subtle changes speak loudly. Her murmuring has not changed. Her habits remain the same. She still weaves for hours, speaking softly to keep track of her patterns. She still walks to the forest to gather plants, herbs, and bark for dyes. She still prefers quiet over noise, solitude over crowds. But the world around her has begun to reinterpret these normalities into something curious, something suspicious. In medieval life, silence is a strange thing. It is respected in monks, feared in widows, admired in nobles, and distrusted in common folk. People who speak too little leave room for others to fill the silence with their own ideas. And so the village has done exactly that. You sit beside Elswith as she works at her loom on a particularly gloomy afternoon. Outside, clouds hang low over the landscape, casting gray light that diffuses softly through the small round window. The faint smell of damp wool and drying herbs thickens the air. She weaves slowly today. Something is weighing on her. For the first time since you have observed her, she is murmuring less, pausing more often, hesitating, occasionally glancing at the door as if expecting someone to knock. Her murmured words seem more like attempts to steady herself rather than maintain focus. You watch the threads pass between her fingers, thin and delicate as spider silk. The rhythm that usually fills her cottage is disrupted by tiny inconsistencies, an uneven pull, a skipped breath, a noticeable pause before tightening the thread. She is not losing her skill, she is losing her ease. Her world, once quiet but predictable, now feels uncertain. A visitor at the door. The first knock comes later that day, just after dusk. It is a soft knock, hesitant, almost awkward. Ellsworth stiffens at the sound. Visitors are rare. She wipes her hands on her apron, smooths her hair, and opens the door. Outside stands Ida, the village woman who saw her in the forest weeks earlier. She wears a cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her breath comes out in pale clouds. Her eyes flicker between curiosity and discomfort. "Ellsworth," she says, trying to maintain a friendly tone. I wanted to bring you some broth. My husband made too much." It is a lie. You can see it in the way she holds the small clay pot, gripping it too tightly, delivering it too quickly. But Ellsworth smiles politely and accepts it. "Thank you," she murmurs. Ida hesitates, clearly wanting to stay long enough to observe something unusual. Her curiosity has grown into something deeper, something tinged with caution. She steps forward slightly, peering inside the cottage. "You spend much of your time alone," she says, as though making casual conversation. Ellsworth nods. "I find peace in quiet." "Peace?" Ida repeats, her tone uncertain. I suppose that is good." She glances at the loom, at the herbs hanging from the rafters, at the dye pots near the hearth. She wants to ask about the murmuring, about the forest, about the rumors, but she cannot bring herself to do it openly. Instead, she asks another question. "Do you ever hear things? When you're alone?" Ellsworth tilts her head, genuinely confused. "I hear my weaving, the wind, birds in the morning." This answer seems too simple for Ida, who has already filled the empty spaces with her own imagination. She forces a smile, steps back, and quickly takes her leave. After she leaves, Ellsworth stands near the doorway for a long time, staring into the darkness. You sense that she knows, deep down, that this was not simply a friendly visit. Something is coming, something that may not be kind. Whispers turning heavy. Over the next week, more visits follow, none overtly confrontational, but all unsettling. Villagers pass by her cottage more often than necessary. Some pretend to check the road, others claim to be looking for lost sheep, while others simply linger nearby, as though waiting to see something unusual. One evening, Leofric, a middle-aged farmer with a stern face, knocks on her door. He asks if she has seen strange animals in the forest. Another day, the blacksmith stops her at the well and asks if she has been feeling herself lately. A group of children watch her from a distance as she carries a bundle of wool across the village, whispering behind their hands. Every conversation skirts around the same suspicion, though no one speaks it aloud. And still, Ellsworth murmurs, not because she is unaware, not because she is troubled, but because it is part of her craft, part of her being. Yet the villagers see only what they expect to see, confirmation of their growing fears. The priest concerns. The final shift occurs when Father Dunstan decides to visit her personally. His black cloak sweeps across the ground as he walks toward her cottage one afternoon, his steps heavy and deliberate. The villagers watch from afar with a mix of curiosity and relief. They believe their concerns are finally being taken seriously. Elswith hears the knock and answers the door with her usual quiet warmth. But the moment she sees the priest, her posture stiffens, not from guilt, but from the sense that this visit carries weight. "May I come in?" Dunstan asks. She nods and steps aside. He surveys the interior, the loom, the herbs, the dye pots, the simmering broth on the hearth, the orderly simplicity of the room. He does not see witchcraft or madness. He sees a woman's life. But he also sees the fear in the eyes of his parishioners, and fear can be persuasive. He clears his throat. "Elswith," he begins gently, "there are concerns among the villagers." She looks at him calmly. "About what?" "About your solitude. And your murmuring." "My murmuring?" she repeats. He nods. "You speak aloud when you work, when you walk, when you gather herbs." "Yes," she says. "It helps me keep track of patterns." Father Dunstan considers this. In truth, he understands. Monks chant to maintain rhythm during long tasks. Priests murmur prayers to themselves as they prepare for services. But the villagers do not see the world through such distinctions. They see strangeness. They see difference. "They fear," he says carefully, "that you may be troubled, or that something unseen troubles you." Elswith stands perfectly still. Her hands rest loosely at her sides. She looks neither defensive nor ashamed, only bewildered. "Troubled by what?" she asks. He cannot answer, not directly. Instead, he speaks of the dangers of isolation, the trickery of melancholy, the risk of misunderstanding. He mentions spirits only once, briefly, but the implication hangs heavy in the air. Elswith listens, her face softening not with fear, but with sadness. When he finishes, she speaks slowly. "Father, I talk to myself because it helps me think. I work alone because it brings me peace. I walk in the forest because I need plants for my dyes. I harm no one. I speak to no spirits. I keep to myself so I do not burden others with my quiet nature." Father Dunstan studies her face. For a moment, you feel he might finally understand her. But understanding is not always enough to shift the fears of an entire village. He sighs. "I will tell them what you have told me," he says. "But people fear what they do not understand." He leaves quietly, leaving Elswith standing in the doorway long after he is gone. The meeting at the green. 2 days later, a meeting is held at the village green. Not officially a council meeting, nothing so formal, but rather a gathering of villagers who wish to discuss the matter among themselves. Elswith is not invited, but she hears about it through the thin walls of community life. People speak more loudly now, less afraid of her overhearing their concerns. Some argue she is harmless. Others say her murmuring is unnatural. Some claim she is lonely and should be helped. Others insist solitude is a breeding ground for darkness. A few suggest she should be watched more closely. One man, driven more by boredom than belief, wonders aloud whether she should be questioned again. In medieval society, suspicion rarely leads to violence immediately, but it grows roots. It settles into people's minds. It shapes the way they interpret small actions. A woman who murmurs becomes a woman who chants. A woman who gathers herbs becomes a woman preparing potions. A woman who prefers solitude becomes a woman avoiding witnesses. By the time the meeting ends, the villagers have reached no formal decision, but the unspoken agreement is clear. They will keep an eye on her. And that, in this world, is often the beginning of trouble returning to the loom. When Elswith returns to her cottage after hearing whispers of the meeting, she sits at her loom but does not begin weaving. The room feels colder today, as though the uncertainty outside has seeped in. She touches the threads, tracing them gently with her fingertips. Her murmuring is barely audible now, a faint whisper of her usual rhythm. You sense the heaviness in her chest, a growing realization that her solitude, once her sanctuary, is now her vulnerability. She is no longer simply the weaver at the edge of the village. She is the woman people talk about, the one they watch. She lowers her hands, closes her eyes, and exhales slowly. It is here, in the soft glow of the dying fire, that you begin to understand the true tragedy of her story. Not that she is in danger, not yet, but that her peaceful existence is being reshaped by the fears of others. Fear which has nothing to do with her. Fear which she cannot control. Fear which grows, like a creeping vine, across the walls of her life. And as night settles quietly over the village, you cannot help but wonder if even the simplest behavior, murmuring to oneself, could be misunderstood as madness. How many ordinary lives were reshaped by fear in medieval times? And how many quiet souls, like Elswith, were lost in the shadows of misunderstanding? Threads that outlast the rumors. Winter settles heavily over the village, and with it comes a quiet that feels deeper than usual. Snow collects along the edges of cottages, blanketing rooftops in a soft white layer that muffles sound and makes the world feel strangely distant. Smoke rises in thin, wavering columns from every chimney. The air carries the scent of burning wood and stew simmering slowly in hearths. It is the season when people retreat indoors, turning their thoughts inward, reflecting on the long months ahead. For Elswith, winter has always been a season of comfort. The cold outside contrasts with the warmth of her cottage, where the fire burns steadily and the familiar rhythm of weaving fills the dim light. But this winter feels different. The threads on her loom tremble slightly as she works, not from any wind, but from the uneasy awareness that the village's eyes are still upon her. Rumors, once spoken lightly, now harden in the winter stillness. You sense it every time she steps outside. How people pause their conversations, how their gazes linger a little too long, how children glance nervously before retreating behind their parents' legs. The priest's attempt to reassure the villagers after his visit did little to quell their imagination. In a season where people have more time to think and fewer distractions, speculation becomes a kind of pastime. And yet, life continues. Elswith's weaving remains in high demand. Households preparing for the harsh season need new cloth for blankets, cloaks, and coverings. Monks from a nearby priory send a young novice to purchase bolts of fabric for repairing their garments. A visiting merchant asks for a length of simple wool dyed in the muted blue she creates from woad. These interactions remind her, in small moments, that the world still relies on her work, that she is still part of the village, even if she stands slightly apart from it. But even these exchanges feel tinged with tension. When the merchant steps into her cottage, he glances around as though half expecting to find symbols or strange artifacts hidden in the shadows. The novice monk, polite and soft-spoken, averts his eyes from her murmuring, pretending not to notice. And when locals come to collect their orders, they often stay near the door, as if stepping too far inside might invite something unseen. Elswith notices. She notices everything. A winter of long shadows. The days shorten quickly now. By mid-afternoon, darkness begins its slow descent, casting long shadows over the snow-covered village. Without much sunlight, the cold deepens, turning pathways into frozen tracks and water buckets into solid blocks of ice. Life narrows to essential tasks. In her cottage, Elswith wraps herself in a woolen shawl and leans closer to the loom. The fire flickers gently. The wood crackles in a familiar rhythm. She dips her fingertips into the dye pots, checking their cooling temperature. She sorts through bundles of dried herbs that hang from the rafters. Her murmuring becomes a kind of companion to the silence. Warp, tighten, 2 threads left, fold the edge. She speaks softly, but in the echoing quiet of winter, even soft sounds feel amplified. A passerby on the road outside might hear her through the thin walls and interpret the sound however they wish. In a way, the season magnifies not only sound but also imagination. With less work outdoors and more time huddled around hearths, people spend longer hours exchanging tales. Stories shift and stretch with each telling. What was once merely Elswith speaks to herself slowly transforms into Elswith speaks to unseen beings. Such is the way of medieval storytelling, blending observations with fears, mixing truth with superstition until the lines blur. A faint knock on a frozen evening. One evening, as snow drifts gently past the window, Elswith hears a faint knock at her door. It is hesitant, softer than the sharp rap of urgency, but firmer than a child's timid attempt. She wipes her hands, sets down her shuttle, and opens the door. Standing there is Mother Ethelberg, an elderly widow who lives near the church. Her cloak is dusted with snow, and her hands tremble slightly with the cold. "Elswith, child," she says with a strained smile. "May I come in for a moment?" Elswith nods immediately, stepping aside to let her in. Despite the villagers' growing suspicions, a few people have always seen her as simply quiet. Not strange, not troubled, just different. The old woman warms her hands near the fire, letting out a long sigh. "I heard them talking again," she says finally. "Your name on their tongues." Elswith's shoulders tighten. She sits slowly on the edge of her stool. "What are they saying now?" "That you wander the forest in the night," Ethelberg replies. "That you chant to trees. That you see things they cannot." Elswith shakes her head. "I do no such thing." "I know," the woman says firmly. "But it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what they believe." Elswith lowers her gaze. "Why do they believe such things?" "They are frightened," Ethelberg explains. "Not of you. Of many things. Of illness. Of hunger. Of spirits. Of long winters. When people fear these things, they look for someone to attach their fear to." The truth of these words settles heavily in the room. Elswith sits quietly for a long time. She watches the firelight flicker across the old woman's lined face. She murmurs, barely audible now, something like a prayer or a grounding reminder, though it is not clear even to her what she is saying. When Ethelberg leaves, Elswith stands at the door, watching her walk slowly across the snow-covered path. She feels both grateful and deeply alone, because now, at last, she understands something she had tried not to see. The village's opinion of her is slipping beyond her control. The breaking point. It happens on a morning of biting cold. The village wakes to the discovery of strange tracks near the livestock pens. Long, thin lines in the snow, likely made by a wandering fox or a deer dragging a damaged leg. But in a community already on edge, the tracks become something more ominous. By midday, a group of villagers gathers at the pens, pointing, whispering, gesturing toward the forest. These tracks lead toward Elswith's cottage, someone says. It is true. The creature, whatever it was, passed near her home. But the villagers' minds leap to conclusions. Some murmur about omens. Others speak of spirits moving in the night. A few look visibly shaken. And then someone suggests, quietly, almost under their breath, that perhaps Elswith's murmuring has called something forth. No one openly agrees, but no one disagrees either. Fear does the rest. By afternoon, a group of 5 villagers approaches Elswith's cottage. They are not violent, nor do they intend harm. Their purpose, as they see it, is to ensure the safety of the village. But for someone like Elswith, quiet, solitary, misunderstood, their presence feels heavy, intrusive. She opens the door when they knock, her expression calm but cautious. Leofric, the stern-faced farmer, steps forward. "We wish to ask you some questions," he says. Elswith nods, allowing them inside, though her heart feels tight in her chest. They look around her home with overly careful eyes, noting the herbs, the dyes, the loom. None of these are strange. None are forbidden. Yet fear colors their perception. Leofric clears his throat. "People say they hear you talking to yourself." "I do," she replies simply. "It helps me think." "People say you walk at night." "I do not," she answers. "People fear you may be inviting unwelcome things." Elswith's breath catches slightly. "I invite nothing but quiet." The silence that follows is long and uneasy. You see clearly what is happening. Not a formal accusation, not a mob, but something subtler, the soft, crushing pressure of suspicion. The villagers want reassurance, but they do not truly know what reassurance looks like. They ask questions, but the answers cannot satisfy because the fear they feel is not rooted in truth, but in uncertainty. Finally, the group leaves, uneasy, unconvinced, still searching for explanations that fit their fears. When the door closes, Elswith stands motionless for a long time. The fire crackles behind her. Snow continues to fall softly outside. The threads of her loom hang loose, waiting for her hands. But she does not move. For the first time, her murmuring stops completely. The quiet after the storm. Days pass. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the rumors begin to fade. A hunter spots the same creature that left the tracks, a limping deer. Father Dunstan mentions in a sermon that solitude is sometimes a form of devotion, not danger. The winter deepens, shifting the villagers' focus to survival, mending clothing, repairing tools, rationing food. And gradually, suspicion loses its grip. Elswith remains the same as she has always been, quiet, reflective, steady. But something within her has changed. She no longer assumes she is unseen. She no longer believes her life exists at the edge of notice. She works with the understanding that people will always interpret her in ways she cannot control. But she also discovers something else, her strength. She resumes murmuring. She resumes weaving. She resumes gathering herbs and walking the forest paths, careful but not fearful. Ethelberg visits often. The novice monk returns to purchase more cloth. Even Ida, embarrassed by her earlier curiosity, brings a loaf of bread as an unspoken apology. Life settles back into its familiar shape. But Elswith is not quite the same thread woven into the village's tapestry. She is now a symbol of something larger. A quiet reminder that fear can twist the simplest behaviors into something strange, and that misunderstanding can grow quickly in communities built on close observation but limited knowledge. A reflection for the listener. As you sit with her in the warm glow of her hearth, you realize how her story echoes across centuries. Her murmuring was never madness. Her solitude was never a sign of danger. Her habits were simply misunderstood by a society that lacked the vocabulary to describe mental focus, introversion, anxiety, neurodiversity, or even simple personal preference. In the medieval world, difference often became danger. Quiet became suspicion. Solitude became fear. And even now, you cannot help but ask yourself, how many people in history, quiet, gentle, harmless, were reshaped by the fears of others? And how many today are still judged by patterns others do not understand?